How do we repurpose our cities for autonomous vehicles? That's the subject of today's Inside AB. I'm Bernd Debusmann and I'm here with Jeremy Lawrence. So, Jeremy, it seems every day that autonomous vehicles are becoming more and more of a reality. But in terms of cities and how they're put together, what do we have to think of when we think of our roads, for example, or our infrastructure?
Yeah. So autonomous vehicles, as you say, it is coming. It's not coming, it's here, and it's going to come in a much bigger way very soon. So we need the infrastructure to support all this. So there's two views on how we respond to this. The utopian view, according to UC Berkeley Transportation Sustainable Research Center, is that we'll see a highly streamlined, integrated and human-centric urban order with well-enforced government regulations, lower rates of congestion, lower rates of car ownership because we're all car sharing and using it on demand. That all sounds great. The dystopian view is a recent Yale study which found that if AV fleets are not electrified using renewable energy, by 2050, greenhouse gases and emissions and air pollution could rise by 50%. Because, of course, if it is more convenient, it does take traffic off the roads, theoretically. More people will use it and become more popular and will actually become self-defeating. They also mentioned that system glitches, if you have all these AVs on the road, could cause massive issues. And that's before we even start to get into the problems of safety that people are still not convinced by.
Interesting. So, I mean, once cities are set up with this in mind, I mean, will this even be an improvement on what we're used to today? Well,
again, there's different schools of thought. Let's go back, as we wrote in Arabian Business last week, to a little statistic here that on August the 17th, 1896 in London, 44-year-old Bridget Driscoll stepped off the pavement and into the history books as the first person to be killed by a motor car. And at the inquest, the coroner said he hoped such a thing would never happen again. But of course, that didn't happen. According to the World Health Organization, more than 60 million road deaths and 1.5 billion serious injuries have happened since that fateful day 122 years ago. The point being that if you mix humans with fast-moving pieces of equipment, there's always going to be lots of room for error. Now, so far, automated vehicles, there's only actually been one accident that's been definitely the fault of an AV, and that was Google, after 1.5 million miles traveled. So that's very impressive.
That's interesting. You know, I was recently at an event where I met Steve Wozniak, Apple co-founder, and he said that he had given up on the idea of autonomous cars because they have to be on the road with human-driven cars. So there's obviously quite a lot of issues, you know, around the concept still, isn't there?
Well, this is it. So far, the self-driving tests taken place sort of fairly in isolated, controlled surroundings. But the issue is, of course, is that these cars are going to be operating on roads, messy roads, where people are also there, and you know, in some countries, livestock and children and everything else that you get in cities and in our infrastructure. So it's not a perfect world that they're operating in. Then, of course, you've got the problem over AVs. One of the big ones is they're having to make moral decisions. We've all heard the moral question. If you had to swerve off the road and you definitely hit one person, but you would avoid possibly killing 12 other people, what's the right thing to do? So you'd actually have to program that into a car to say, kill the one person, for example. So that's a big question.
So, I mean, what ideas have been put forth to deal with those issues?
There have been cities and countries that are thinking about how to do this. So, for example, in New York, they've had the idea of the New York loop design proposal, which talks about converging major cross streets into expressways that would form a loop around Manhattan with walkways above it. So it sort of makes a whole new sort of system for people, you know, the pedestrians in one place and the cars are in the other. Then we've also got ideas around taxation and legislation. That's going to be really important. Many countries, such as in the EU, like the UK, already do. They've got annual road taxes based on carbon emissions. Progressive nations like Norway go even further with zero taxes on electric vehicles. And by 2030, some European countries are going to be banning outright diesel cars. So new legislation is going to be really important to steering us in the direction of where we decide as nations to go.
So couldn't we also just kind of start again with new purpose-built smart cities that take this into account from the beginning?
We've had hundreds of urban mega projects springing up in places like China. We've had King Abdullah Economic City in Saudi. We've had Songdo in South Korea. and Egypt, they've talked about it. These have a good deal of autonomy built into them mainly because they're privately owned, so they can try different things. They haven't got all the red tape that goes along with a normal city. Then you've got smaller experiments such as Babcock Ranch in Florida that are embracing renewable energies, and AVs are their sort of new normal. Traditional car transport is restricted there, and there's no resistance to this because people have signed up to be there from the outset. So that's been used as a good launch pad for new ideas. And then you've got Google as building a mock city, the Castle, somewhere outside San Francisco in Silicon Valley to test its self-driving cars. So this is a great idea. It can work really well, but of course that's not practical for most of the world.
And what lessons can we draw from this whole issue?
Yeah, several. So firstly, the big one is something else we've talked about this week already, is that the private and public sectors have to work together on this. There's so much legislation and red tape and so many stakeholders involved. It can't be Google or the government. It has to be both, or Tesla or whoever it is. The obvious way is, where we can, is to start from scratch with these new cities, but as we said, that's not always practical. And what we have to do in reality is repurpose a lot of what we already have. We already have these huge areas, if you think about in Dubai, that are devoted to roads. You've actually got a lot of space there to play with. So we've got to think about how we continue to evolve and use the things that we've already built. And finally, as a sort of parting shot really, it's not so much about the technology or about the infrastructure, it's how do we use it in a way that keeps people safe and that keeps people moving around. Ultimately it's the practicalities of it that will win out in the end, or not, as the case may be.
Okay, well thank you. That's very interesting actually.
Yeah.
For more information about autonomous vehicles, there's lots and lots of stories about it on arabianbusiness.com. Make sure to tune in to YouTube every weekday morning at 10 a.m. for Inside AB and subscribe below. Thank you.